Elsewhere, I've referred to members of political groups that support the conservative right as red state fascists. And I don't use the phrase merely for rhetorical purposes. There was and is something called fascism as a non-leftist form of social theory that puts unlimited faith in the state to correct what they see as the flaws in society and the world. Let's look more closely at the conservative view of police power. While it's true that law itself is critical to freedom, and police can defend rights of life and property, it does not follow that any tax-paid fellow bearing official arms and sporting jackboots is on the side of the good. Every government regulation and tax is ultimately backed by the police power. So free market advocates have every reason to be as suspicious of socialist-style police powers as anyone on the left. Uncritical attitudes towards the police lead in the end to the support of the police state, and in turn to the celebration of American imperialism as somehow filling a void in the world. And to those who doubt that, I would invite a look at the US-backed regime in Iraq, which has been enforcing martial law since the invasion, even while most conservatives have been glad to believe that these methods constitute steps towards freedom. I don't see this as a contradiction of conservative principles. It appears as the fulfillment of their essentially Hobbesian view of how society must function. And the problem of police power is hitting Americans very close to home. It is the police, much militarized and federalized, who are charged with enforcing the on-again, off-again states of emergency that have characterized recent American civilian life. It is the police who confiscated guns from New Orleans residents during the flood, kept residents away from their homes, refused to let the kids go home in the Alabama tornado earlier this spring, and will be the enforcers of the curfews, checkpoints, and speech controls that the politicians want during the next national emergency. If we want to see the way that police power could treat U.S. citizens, look carefully at how the U.S. troops in Iraq are treating the civilians there, or how prisoners in Guantanamo Bay are treated. A leading contender for the Republican nomination received wild cheers when he proposed to double the capacity of Guantanamo. This ideology of power is inherent in post-war conservatism, and that is particularly clear when it comes to war. In the 1970s, they developed a myth on the right that the real problem with Vietnam was not the intervention itself, but the failure to carry it out to an even more grim and ruthless end. This seems to be the only lesson the Bush administration garnered from the experience. So the solution to every problem in Iraq, at least I can't think of any exceptions to this rule, have been to apply more force through more troops, more bombs, more planes, more helicopters, more tanks, more guns, more curfews, more patrols, more checkpoints, more controls of every sort. They believe that another surge will work wonders because they're out of ideas. It's as if the administration were on an intellectual trajectory that it cannot escape. Even after all the evidence that the war on terror has produced even more terrorism, and this evidence is offered up by the government's own statistics, the champions of the war on terror cannot think their way out of the intellectual trap into which their ideology of force has locked them. How is it that the war planners and their vast numbers of supporters on this question do not question the underlying assumption that government is capable of achieving all its aims, provided only that it is given enough time and enough firepower? Let's look more carefully at their crude form of Hobbesianism. Thomas Hobbes's book Leviathan was published in 1651 during the Civil War in order to justify a tyrannical central government as the price of peace. The natural state of society, he said, was war of all against all. In this world, life was, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Conflict was the way of human engagement. Society is rife with it, and it cannot be otherwise. What is striking here is the context of this book. Conflict was indeed ubiquitous, but what was the conflict over? It was over who would control the state and how the state would operate. This was not a state of nature, but a society under Leviathan's control. It was precisely the Leviathan that bred the very conflict that Hobbes was addressing, and he proposed a cure that was essentially identical to the disease. In fact, the result of the Civil War was the brutal and ghastly dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell, who ruled under democratic slogans. This was a foreshadowing of some of the worst political violence of the 20th century. It was Nazism, fascism, and communism that transformed formerly peaceful societies into violent communities in which life did indeed become solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Leviathan didn't fix the problem, it bred it and fastened it on society. What is striking about Hobbes is that he thought not at all about economic problems. The problem of human material well-being was not part of his intellectual apparatus. He could not have imagined what England would become a century to a century and a half later, a bastion of freedom and of rising prosperity for everyone. He wrote at the tail end of an epoch before the rise of old-style liberalism. At the time that Hobbes was writing, the liberal idea had not yet become part of public consciousness in England. In this respect, England was behind the continent, where intellectuals in Spain and France had already come to understand the core insights of the liberal idea. But in England, John Locke's 2 treatises on government would not be written for another 30 years, a book that would supply the essential framework of the Declaration of Independence and lead to the foundation and formation of the freest and most prosperous society in the history of the world. Because Hobbes didn't think about economic issues, the essential liberal insight was not part of his thinking. And what is this insight? It's summed up in Frederick Bastiat's claim that, quote, the great social tendencies are harmonious. What Bastiat means by this is that society contains within itself the capacity to resolve conflicts and to create and sustain institutions that further social cooperation. By pursuing their individual self-interest, people can come to mutual agreement and engage in exchange to their mutual benefit. A critical insight here, one that needs to be taught to every generation, relates to the law of association. The law of association points out that people of radically different abilities, backgrounds, religions, races, and capacities can successfully cooperate to achieve ever higher levels of social welfare through negotiation and trade. The law of association is what explains the method by which humans were able to move out of caves, away from isolated production, beyond the hunter-gatherer stage, and into what we call civilization. This law makes it possible for people not to steal from each other, not to kill each other, but to cooperate. It is the basis of society. It is also the basis of international order. Note that the law of association does not suppose that everyone in society is smart, enlightened, talented, reasonable, or educated. It presumes, in fact, radical inequality and points to the paradox that the world's smartest, most talented person still has every reason to trade with his polar opposite, because scarcity requires that the tasks of production be divided between people. Under the division of labor, everyone plays an essential role. It is the basis of families, communities, firms, and international trade. Another fact that needs to be understood is this: the law of association is a fact of human existence, whether or not there is a state. Indeed, the foundation of civilization itself precedes the existence of the state. What the law of association addresses is the core problem of freedom itself. If all people were equal, if everyone had the same skill level, if there were racial, sexual, and religious homogeneity in society, if people did not have differences of opinion, there would be few, if any, problems in society to overcome, because it would not be a human society. It would be an ant heap or a series of machine parts with no volition. The essential problem of social and economic organization, apart from scarcity, is precisely how to deal with the fact of inequality and free will. It is here that freedom excels. Let us be clear. The old liberals were not saying there were no such things as criminals. They were saying that society can deal with malevolence through the exchange economy, and in precisely the way we see hinted at today in private security companies, private production of locks and guns, private arbitration, and private insurance. The free market can organize protection better than the state. Private enterprise can and does provide the police function better than the state. As Hayek argued, the state is wildly overrated as a mechanism of order keeping. The state is and has been in history a source of disorder and chaos. The essential insight of liberalism is what led the Founding Fathers to take such a radical step in overthrowing the rule of Great Britain. They had to be firmly convinced that chaos would not ensue, that the American people could manage their own affairs without an overarching Leviathan.